A young millionaire gets a poor young woman pregnant and abandons her. 5 years later, she reappears, seeks out the millionaire, and leaves everyone in shock with her reaction. Thomas had everything anyone could dream of: a substantial bank account, a respected name in society, and the world at his feet. At 27, his life was a sequence of luxurious dinners, extravagant parties, and yacht trips, where a new face seemed to accompany him every week. His impeccable style and natural charm made him the center of attention wherever he went. Yet, inside, Thomas carried an emptiness that consumed him, a feeling that despite everything he possessed, something essential was missing. But he ignored that feeling like someone turning away from an uncomfortable sight. On a cold autumn morning, Thomas walked through the city after a long and forgettable night. On impulse, he decided to step into a simple and cozy cafe, a place he would never have chosen in his extravagant daily life. The mild aroma of coffee and fresh bread contrasted with the sophisticated places he was used to, and something about that place piqued his curiosity. He took a deep breath and looked around, almost as if he were a foreigner in unfamiliar lands. That's when he saw her. Sarah was behind the counter, carefully organizing cups and cutlery. Her movements were gentle, her eyes had a serene and deep glow that immediately captivated Thomas. He watched her in silence for a moment, noticing how genuinely connected she seemed to be with what she was doing, something he rarely saw in the superficial world he inhabited. There was something delicate and mysterious about her, an almost poetic simplicity that stood in stark contrast to everything he knew. When Sarah noticed his stare, she smiled gently as if he were just another customer among many. "Good morning, what would you like today?" she asked in a calm and welcoming voice. Thomas, usually brimming with confidence and always with a ready answer, felt strangely vulnerable. He stuttered slightly, not knowing what to say, and ended up ordering a simple coffee, something he rarely drank but felt right at that moment. While Sarah prepared his order, Thomas noticed small details that for some reason charmed him. The stray strands of her hair tied up in a loose bun, her slightly worn nails, the look of concentration on her face. There was a different aura around her, the glow of someone who seemed at peace with herself, something he, with all his excesses, had never felt. When Sarah handed him the coffee, their fingers brushed slightly, a touch as brief as it was unexpected. Thomas felt a slight shiver, and his mind, trained to seek only momentary pleasure, was surprised by a new sensation. He smiled, somewhat disconcerted, and before he realized it, he was striking up a conversation. "Do you always work here?" he asked, feigning nonchalance. She laughed softly, and he noticed her laughter was as sincere as her presence there. "Yes, for a year now," Sarah replied, looking him in the eyes without fear or ulterior motives. Thomas was not used to conversations like this, where nothing was said with the intent to please or impress. Sarah just spoke with the lightness of someone who expected nothing in return. This disarmed him, and he felt he was in front of someone rare. For the first time in a long while, Thomas wanted to listen instead of talk. Their brief conversation was filled with pauses and curious glances. They didn't talk about grand or remarkable topics, but the way she listened to him, with authentic attention, made Thomas forget where he was and the life waiting for him outside. In those few minutes, he found himself wanting to know more, to understand what made someone so free in her simplicity. When he left the cafe, Thomas realized that, strangely, he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. Thomas and Sarah started seeing each other frequently after that first meeting at the cafe. He, intrigued by her simplicity, and she, captivated by the intensity of his interest, entered into an engaging and intense rhythm. Their meetings were secret, punctuated by sudden messages and invitations to dinners at places she never dreamed of going. Thomas loved to surprise her and take her to expensive, luxurious places. For him, the look of wonder in Sarah's eyes was a fleeting satisfaction, something that stroked his vanity but that he saw only as a temporary source of pleasure. For Sarah, however, it all felt like a dream. She never imagined that a man like Thomas, so confident and full of life, could be interested in someone like her. The difference in their worlds was evident. Sarah lived in a small apartment on the outskirts, and her life was summed up by her job at the cafe, while Thomas seemed to live in a parallel reality where everything was beautiful and accessible. But she decided to let herself be swept up, believing he saw something special in her. During their meetings, Sarah showed a sweetness and sincerity that Thomas rarely found in the people around him. But gradually, cracks began to appear. Thomas, accustomed to fleeting relationships, did not understand Sarah's need for deeper conversations, for a real connection. He avoided them, changing the subject or insisting on taking her to parties where she felt out of place. One evening, during a luxurious dinner, Sarah mentioned how grateful she was for having him in her life and how she dreamed of a future with someone who valued her. Thomas looked away, uncomfortable, muttering something about letting things happen naturally, a euphemism for, "I'm not willing to commit." For him, the romance was beginning to lose its luster. Thomas craved constant novelty, adventures that distracted him from a life that, despite everything he owned, felt unbearably empty. Soon, the messages became more sporadic, the meetings colder. He made no promises, and when Sarah asked about the future, he responded evasively. He sensed she was starting to expect something more serious, and that gave him a feeling of entrapment he couldn't stand. Sarah noticed the change. The absence of messages, the canceled invitations, the empty excuses he gave when disappearing for days. Her intuition warned her that something was wrong, but her heart was reluctant to accept that the special connection they shared was slipping away. Each time they were together, she tried to show the best version of herself, trying to keep him interested. But despite her efforts, Thomas grew increasingly distant, and her silent sadness only made him feel more pressured. One of the last nights they spent together, Thomas invited her to an exclusive party, an elegant but impersonal environment full of familiar, indifferent faces. Sarah, in a simple dress, felt like an outsider in that world of people who spoke of international destinations and new investments. Thomas, with a distracted gaze, barely seemed to notice her at his side, engrossed in conversations about business and surrounded by acquaintances who ignored her presence. Sarah tried to mask her discomfort, but when she saw him flirting with a high society woman, she felt her heart break into pieces. After that night, things were never the same. Their contact became increasingly rare, until the messages stopped altogether. Thomas didn't bother to explain. In fact, he preferred to let time dissolve what, to him, was never serious. He dove back into his frenetic routine of parties and new faces without looking back. What he didn't know was that by leaving Sarah's life so coldly, he was leaving an immense void in her life, and a consequence that would change their lives forever. Sarah discovered her pregnancy almost silently, a suspicion that gradually took shape in subtle signs until it became an undeniable truth. The test confirmed what she had feared, and when she saw the two lines appear, a mixture of emotion and apprehension washed over her. Alone in her small apartment, her thoughts went straight to Thomas, and the only certainty she had was that she needed to tell him, hoping that this life could, in some way, touch something in his heart. Determined, she took a deep breath and arranged to meet him, imagining every possible reaction. In the cafe where it all began, Sarah waited for Thomas, her heart racing. When she saw him arrive, with an indifferent look and a posture that screamed disinterest, she nearly backed out. But this was not a time for hesitation. "Thomas, I'm pregnant," she said at last in a firm voice that masked her vulnerability. He froze, his face expressionless for a moment, as if her words were either irrelevant or almost inconceivable. His silence was a shock, a cold wave that started to extinguish any hope Sarah had held on to. Thomas finally sighed, his face taking on a slightly impatient look. "You know I can't take on that kind of responsibility now," he began in a tone that sounded more like a rehearsed speech than a genuine conversation. He mentioned commitments, business, and his aversion to unnecessary complications, as if he were discussing an inconvenient contract rather than a life they had created together. Sarah listened, trying to understand where the man who had charmed her weeks before had gone. Sensing her discomfort, Thomas didn't take long to offer what he thought was a practical solution. "I can help you financially," he proposed, as if offering an easy fix for a problem he didn't want to deal with. He mentioned sums, promised support, but without any hint of presence or responsibility. For him, solving it with money seemed the quickest and most convenient way to end the issue. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling humiliation wash over her. "Thomas, I'm not here for your money," she said, her voice faltering slightly, but her gaze remaining firm. Each of his words was further proof that the man before her was not the same person she had shared sincere moments with. There was a coldness in Thomas, a hardness she had never imagined, and it now crushed any illusion that she could rely on him. Unfazed, Thomas continued, almost as if his offer was irresistible. "I think it would be better for both of us, Sarah. Think about the future the money can provide for. The baby?" The word seemed to stick in his throat, as if the concept of fatherhood was as impossible as it was unacceptable. He looked at her with an artificial calm, expecting her to understand and accept his bargain. Sarah looked at him, her chest filled with a feeling that was a mix of anger and sadness, like saying goodbye to a shattered dream. With heavy breathing and tear-filled eyes, Sarah stood up. "I don't need your money, Thomas. I just wanted you to know," she said firmly. There was nothing more to be said. She realized then that she was alone in this journey and that he would never become the man she had hoped for. As she looked into his indifferent eyes, she felt a strength rise in her chest, one that surpassed her disappointment. Thomas watched her leave, visibly relieved that he didn't need to insist. For him, the matter was closed. And as soon as Sarah left the cafe, he returned to his messages and engagements as if nothing had happened. But deep down, a small discomfort nagged at him, a thought he avoided but that seemed to echo in his mind. The possibility that he had just lost something he would never understand. Outside, Sarah walked through the streets, feeling a mix of helplessness and determination. The cold wind of that afternoon seemed to carry away all the empty promises and the image of a future that would never be. She walked away from that encounter with renewed purpose. Sarah returned home that night with her mind full of thoughts and her heart broken. The disappointment burned in her chest, but at the same time she felt a strength she had never known before. The cold image of Thomas haunted her, but she knew that from that moment on she could no longer let herself be defeated. In her womb, a life was growing, and that life was already all that mattered. She was determined to be the support, security, and love her child would need. Even alone, she would face this journey with courage. In the days that followed, Sarah revisited Thomas's proposal in her mind, weighing the paths she would take if she accepted his money. But with every thought, one certainty became stronger, that financial support would be like a constant shadow, a reminder that he had chosen to stay away and handle everything from a distance. She did not want her child to come into the world with an emotional debt even before learning to speak. So, with firm resolve, she decided to cut any ties with Thomas. Every time she looked at the ultrasound, Sarah felt a wave of emotions. She smiled to herself, touching her belly as if she could already feel the baby's presence. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, seeking strength in her own words. Her savings were small, and her salary at the cafe was modest, but she remained undaunted. Somehow, she knew she would find a way to move forward. What she lacked in wealth, she would make up for with love and dedication. When she shared her decision with the few friends who knew about her situation, she received worried looks and words of consolation. "Sarah, are you sure? He could help you at least until the baby is born," insisted a colleague, trying to persuade her. But Sarah shook her head firmly. "I don't want my child to feel like a burden to someone who never wanted him. He will have a mother who loves him, and that's enough," she replied, with a conviction that even surprised herself. Months passed, and each stage of pregnancy became a new test of her strength. Alone at her medical appointments, she patiently waited, watching other couples exchange smiles and hold hands. With every ultrasound, seeing the little heart beating, her resolve grew stronger. She felt she was building a deep bond, an unconditional love that would be the foundation of everything. Each beat of that tiny heart echoed within her as a reminder that she was on the right path. Gradually, Sarah adjusted to her new routine. She began working more hours at the cafe, taking advantage of every opportunity to save money. At night, sitting in her small apartment, she prepared the baby clothes she received from donations, sewing little details to add a special touch, all the while thinking about every small detail of the future. It wasn't an easy life, but it was full of meaning. She knew she was laying down the first pieces of a home. In moments of exhaustion, Sarah allowed herself a few tears, but never out of regret. The thought of raising her child alone didn't scare her. On the contrary, every obstacle seemed to reinforce her determination. She was certain that no matter how difficult the path, her decision had been the most dignified. And that was all that mattered. On the hardest days, she would embrace her belly and whisper words of love and hope, convinced that her child could feel them. When the baby was finally born, her eyes sparkled with joy and tears. She held the little one in her arms, admiring every detail, the tiny hand gripping her finger tightly, and the innocent, curious gaze. "We're going to build a world of our own," she promised softly, feeling that this was the moment when her life found true purpose. With every touch and sigh from the baby, Sarah knew that her journey, though solitary, would be blessed by love. Time passed slowly, but each moment with her son was a reward that filled the void left by Thomas's absence. The first years were a mixture of challenges and discoveries for Sarah, but with each sacrifice she felt her bond with her son strengthen in an indescribable way. Her small apartment was modest, simply decorated, but his presence lit up every corner, bringing warmth and joy to their home. The boy, whom she named Lucas, was her reason for living. Every smile, every first step, and every word were gifts that made Sarah forget any fatigue. The days at work were long and exhausting, but at the end of each day, Sarah would return home and find in Lucas's eyes the reason for every effort. While many parents outsource the care of their children, Sarah made it a point to be present in every moment of Lucas's life. Her nights were filled with made-up stories, tight hugs, and whispered promises that together they would overcome any challenge. Lucas, with his curious and tender gaze, was a sweet and attentive child. He noticed the little details like the way his mother smiled at him, even on days when money was tight and bills seemed to multiply. Whenever he could, he helped as best he could, tidying up his toys, drawing cards for her, and even trying to make her laugh with funny faces. Sarah knew she couldn't give him the luxuries she wished she could, but each hug and kind word created a home where love was never lacking. On weekends, Sarah and Lucas embarked on little adventures. They walked through the park, where she taught him to admire the flowers and the birds playing in the trees. On Saturdays, she often saved up to buy him an ice cream, a simple treat that lit up Lucas's face with joy. These moments were a breath of fresh air for both of them, a reminder that happiness was built on the little things in the time spent together and the memories they created. At night, after Lucas fell asleep, Sarah would sit by his bed and watch his peaceful face, as if the simple act of seeing him sleep renewed her strength. "You are my treasure, my miracle," she would whisper, lightly touching his little face. In moments like these, she felt like the richest person in the world. Although her finances were limited and her responsibilities heavy, the unconditional love between mother and son gave her a strength she had never imagined possessing. As Lucas grew, Sarah's understanding of the world they lived in deepened as well. The financial challenges became more evident as he began to ask questions about things they saw in shop windows and what other friends had. Sarah, always honest and affectionate, explained that they might not be able to have everything, but that would never diminish the love and dedication that existed between them. Lucas listened attentively, accepting her words with a surprising understanding for his age. On the coldest nights, Sarah and Lucas would cuddle on the sofa, sharing a blanket and watching the same cartoons repeatedly. Amid laughter and curious questions, Sarah felt that despite all the difficulties, those moments were more valuable than any luxury money could buy. Lucas's laughter lit up their humble home, transforming it into a warm, lively place. Sometimes, Sarah was overtaken by a deep weariness, the kind that comes from years of silent and constant effort. On days like that, Lucas would notice and hug her, pressing his face against hers. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll take care of you," he would say, with the innocence and sincerity that only a child could have. Those words, even though they were said without much understanding of their meaning, renewed Sarah's energy, who found in her son's love the reason to keep going. The 5 years passed like a breeze, leaving traces of love, overcoming, and the certainty that they had created something precious, a life built with dignity and affection, where the essential was measured in smiles and shared hugs, not riches. The hall was stunning that night, reflecting the power and fortune that surrounded Thomas's family name. The event, meticulously planned, brought together influential figures from the financial sector, businessmen, politicians, and high society personalities. Thomas, impeccable in his tailored suit, moved around with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Every smile and handshake was calculated, and he knew that every admiring glance around him represented acknowledgement of his status. He was finally on the brink of inheriting the empire he had long coveted. Beside him was Amanda, his fiancée and the perfect partner for the image Thomas wanted to project. Amanda was a renowned socialite, known for both her beauty and her skill in navigating the complex social circles they inhabited. She was always flawless, wearing an elegant dress that perfectly matched the tones of the hall. The two of them made a couple that drew looks of approval and, at times, envy. For Thomas, she was the final piece that solidified the image of success he had been cultivating for years. While conversing with some investors, Thomas noticed the proud glances of his parents, who had always prepared him for this moment. It was the night where, more than ever, he represented the family legacy, the future of an empire built on ambition and power. He was already rehearsing the speech he would give, thanking his family and team and confirming plans for the company's expansion. For Thomas, everything was perfectly under control. As the evening advanced, guests moved around the hall, champagne flutes in hand, exchanging laughter and compliments amid the soft sound of classical music. Thomas maintained his composure, but his gaze often met Amanda's, who smiled back as if they shared a secret. The future seemed planned and settled, each detail meticulously calculated for greatness. The inheritance, the wedding, the connections, every piece in its place. During a brief speech from his father, who recounted the family's accomplishments, Thomas observed the impressed looks around him. The spotlight was on him, the heir. He felt invincible. He was the symbol of the new generation of the family, prepared to take over the empire, and his parents watched with silent pride, confident that Thomas, with his cool elegance and firm posture, was exactly what the business needed. As applause filled the room, Thomas squinted slightly, intent on absorbing that moment as a promise of personal glory. He believed he had overcome any shadow of the past, erased any connection with mistakes and distractions that could threaten the success he had achieved. The night was his, and nothing could derail the path he had so carefully constructed. Or so he thought. At a certain point, he allowed himself to relax next to Amanda, who whispered something playful in his ear, making him laugh lightly. To onlookers, they were the perfect picture of a powerful couple, ready to command and build an impeccable legacy together. The superficiality of their lives seemed an irrelevant detail, as the image was solid, and the image was what mattered. Thomas barely noticed an unusual movement at the entrance of the hall. An unexpected figure, seemingly out of place amidst the event's exaggerated elegance, had appeared and caught the attention of the guests. He was too occupied with soaking up the attention and congratulations to notice, until a louder murmur and surprised looks began to spread like a ripple. Something was about to interrupt his moment of glory. Before he could turn to see what was causing the stir, a strange feeling overcame him, a premonition that the control he thought he had was slipping rapidly from his grasp. While Thomas was still absorbed in his moment of glory, the unexpected figure finally caught his attention. When he looked toward the entrance, his smile froze and his heart skipped a beat. There stood Sarah, wearing a simple dress but exuding dignity, and beside her, a child. The boy, with bright eyes and a curious expression, left no doubt. The resemblance to Thomas was undeniable. The same intense gaze, the focused expression, the features that betrayed a truth hidden for 5 years. The guests, initially confused, began to murmur among themselves, forming a wave of shock and curiosity that swept through the hall. Sarah, standing tall and with a firm gaze, crossed the space as if on a mission and did not hesitate. She stopped a few steps from Thomas, who was still trying to process what he was seeing, and looked at him with a calm that disarmed him. The world around seemed to be suspended. Every detail of that moment was intensely absorbed by everyone. Thomas tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. He stared at the boy as if he were looking at a mirror reflecting his own childhood. Still unable to process everything, he felt Amanda's cold hand grip his arm, as she too tried to understand what was unfolding before her eyes. The pride and confidence from minutes earlier evaporated, and he found himself vulnerable, stripped of any control. Sarah took a deep breath, looking directly at him, and without ceremony, declared in a voice that reached every corner of the hall, "I did not come here to ask for anything, Thomas. I just thought our son deserved to know who his father is." The statement was made with a calm and dignity that silenced any attempt at murmurs. The hall fell still, and an invisible tension hung in the air, carried by the weight of those words. Reactions were immediate, though silent. Amanda, standing next to Thomas, stepped back a few paces, feeling the impact of Sarah's words like an unexpected blow. Thomas's mother's gaze filled with a mix of astonishment and discomfort, while his father maintained a rigid expression, but with eyes fixed on the child who could be his grandson. The truth now hung between them all, an undeniable force. The boy, not fully understanding the reason for the commotion, watched everything with curiosity, his eyes turning to Thomas with innocence but firmness. He seemed to take in every detail as if, somehow, this encounter was exactly what he had been waiting for. For Thomas, however, the weight of that gaze unsettled him, as if being summoned to answer for something he had tried to bury in the past. Thomas finally managed to speak, but his voice came out weak, almost a whisper. "Sarah, why did you?" She interrupted him with a sad but determined smile. "I don't need you to understand, Thomas. I just want him to have the chance to know the truth." Her tone was firm, her eyes showing no resentment, only a strength that left him unsettled. He realized that, contrary to his expectations, Sarah had not come back to demand anything but to offer their son something he would never willingly give: the truth. Sarah's dignity and calmness were almost disconcerting, and observing her posture, Thomas felt an increasing unease, as if finally understanding the depth of the choices he had made. Everyone in the hall, previously focused on his image and the event, now looked at him with expressions of surprise and silent judgment. The boy stared at him, and for the first time in years, Thomas felt the weight of what he had truly left behind. Sarah remained silent after her revelation, but her presence said everything that needed to be said. She held her son's hand, and the boy looked up at her with trust and affection. Thomas felt something he never imagined he would, an overwhelming guilt mixed with a strange sense of loss as he watched them together, realizing that, unknowingly, he had lost years he could never reclaim. A heavy silence fell over the hall, as if the very air had been sucked out. The incredulous stares of the guests shifted between Sarah, Thomas, and the boy. The child's presence there, with features that reflected Thomas's face, left no room for doubt. But what shocked everyone the most was not just the physical resemblance. It was Sarah's serene and resolute attitude, the dignified way she held her head high, without anger or recrimination, only an unbreakable peace. Thomas felt the weight of every gaze on him, carrying a mix of surprise, judgment, and even pity. Those who admired him just moments earlier now looked at him with a strange curiosity, as if he were part of a scandal. He swallowed hard, still unable to process the scene unfolding. Even Amanda, who until then had stood firm at his side, looked at the boy with a troubled expression, as if the reality she thought she controlled was crumbling. Thomas's mother, the family matriarch, stared at the boy with an intensity no one could interpret. Her eyes moved between Thomas and the child, who seemed to absorb everything with an innocent and curious gaze. Thomas's father, always imposing, remained silent, but his posture had changed, a barely noticeable sign of discomfort and dismay. That boy standing before them changed everything, even the future of an empire they planned to pass on to Thomas. Sarah, meanwhile, stood firm next to her son, holding his hand with a gentle gesture, as if wanting to convey to him the security she herself carried. There was no sadness or resentment in her expression. Her only purpose there seemed to be fulfilling the promise she made to herself and to Lucas. She did not expect acknowledgement or help, just the fulfillment of a truth she had held onto for 5 years. The eyes of those present gradually shifted to the boy, and in that exchange of glances, something unexpected was born. It was as if, for an instant, his innocence erased the discomfort and perplexity. His soft features, the curious look, and even the small gestures that reminded everyone of Thomas caught their attention. Without saying a word, the boy seemed to claim a place that, unconsciously, was already his. Thomas felt a strange pang in his chest as he realized his own son was being embraced by those around him, while he himself became a secondary figure in the scene. He watched the boy with a mix of bewilderment and something close to pride, though he tried to distance himself from it. At that moment, he understood the depth of Sarah's decision. She was there so that the boy could know his father, but not to ask for anything. It was an act of dignity that left him speechless. Sarah's strength seemed to silence any comment. The way she confronted him, without threats or requests, touched even the hardest of hearts. Her posture radiated integrity, and many there realized the weight of what she had endured to stand where she was. Some of the closer guests began to murmur quiet praises about her courage, about the evident sacrifice that made her an extraordinary woman. For the first time that night, Thomas's father stepped towards Sarah. His gaze was stern, but as he bent down to the boy's level, his expression softened. He extended his hand, attempting a smile, and the boy, still not fully understanding what was happening, took his hand with the trust only a child could have. In that moment, something shifted in the heavy air of the room, a silent acknowledgement that the boy was no stranger. The silence persisted, but the atmosphere changed. Thomas realized that something greater than his will was forming around him, and the world he controlled so precisely now seemed to spin on its own. Every face that turned to the boy seemed to accept him as part of something larger. Thomas stood still, not knowing how to react, watching the boy from a distance. He tried to avoid the curious and innocent gaze his son directed at him, but the truth was that this child awakened feelings in him that he did not know how to process. For an instant, he saw his own reflection in the boy's eyes, a resemblance he could not deny. And even though he fought against it, a part of him seemed to recognize and connect with this little stranger. Lucas, intrigued by the man before him, did not look away. He observed Thomas with the curiosity of someone trying to understand something greater, instinctively drawn to his father's presence. Thomas, for his part, felt uncomfortable and fascinated, unable to understand how someone so small could, without saying a single word, stir such a storm of emotions within him. Every gesture of the boy was a reminder of what he had chosen to ignore, and now their reality was finally confronting him. What disturbed him the most was the purity in Lucas's eyes, a gaze free of any judgment or expectation. The boy did not understand the weight of what was happening or the implications of this revelation. For him, it was all a discovery, an encounter. It was their first meeting, a silent and profound moment in which father and son looked at each other as strangers, yet with an invisible bond that seemed to pulse between them. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he noticed the trust in Lucas's eyes, as if the boy expected something from him, even though he did not know what. It was a burden he was not prepared to bear, a responsibility he thought he could avoid. However, there, in front of his son, he felt exposed in a way he had never experienced before. The boy, without uttering a word, seemed to demand an answer he did not have. For a brief moment, Thomas wanted to reach out to touch the boy's shoulder, but an inexplicable fear held him back. How could he act like a father when he had never prepared for it, having spent so long running from that role? The confusion in his mind was evident, and he, who had always prided himself on having answers and control, found himself unraveling under the weight of a simple gaze. As Thomas hesitated, Lucas took a small step toward him as if to close the distance between them. The gesture was subtle but enough to disarm him. He never thought such a simple moment could carry so much meaning. And in that instant, something within him, something he had always suppressed, began to stir. The emptiness he tried to fill with luxury and status seemed to echo there, like a wound that only the boy could heal. Thomas looked around, feeling exposed, and noticed the guests' eyes still fixed on their every move. The judgment, the curiosity, the surprise, all of it felt overwhelming. But as he turned his gaze back to Lucas, those looks lost their importance. It was as if the world around him had become secondary, and all that remained was him and his son. In that shared silence, Thomas realized what was truly at stake. Lucas's vulnerability, the gentle way he looked at him, made Thomas feel a tightness in his chest. It was as if every lost moment, every ignored year, had left marks not on the boy but on him. For the first time he began to understand that his absence had not only hurt Sarah and Lucas, it had created a void within himself that no one else could fill. In an almost involuntary act, Thomas took a small step toward Lucas but stopped before going further, hesitant. The boy looked at him, his eyes full of quiet hope. Thomas did not know what to do, but at that moment, he understood he needed to face the ghosts of his own heart to get closer to the son he had denied, even to himself, for 5 years. The hall remained in absolute silence as Thomas's parents, always strict and reserved, exchanged a meaningful glance. There was in them a mix of surprise and veiled pride for Sarah's firm stance and Lucas's innocence, who looked around curiously. Thomas's mother, who for so many years had valued status and appearances, now seemed to perceive something deeper, something no amount of money could buy. Slowly she stepped forward, her gaze soft, as if each step was a new revelation. As she approached Sarah, Thomas's mother hesitated for a moment, observing the face of the woman who, for 5 years, had borne the weight of a responsibility that was, in part, the family's own. There was an untouchable dignity in Sarah that impressed her. Without further delay, she extended her hand, an unexpected gesture that drew surprised looks from everyone. Sarah, slightly hesitant, accepted the handshake, feeling an unexpected warmth in that firm grip. "I would like to meet my grandson," she said, her voice surprising in its softness and touch of emotion. Lucas, hearing those words, looked at his grandmother with a shy smile, stepping toward her without fear. Thomas's mother watched him with affection, the familiar features awakening deep emotion. It was as if, in that moment, she saw her own son reflected in Lucas, a second chance to be part of something the family had lost. Thomas's father, maintaining his usual strict and composed posture, approached the three with a serene but intense expression. He looked at Lucas and then at Sarah, as if weighing each word he was about to say. "If you allow it, we would like to be part of our grandson's life," he said, his voice revealing more than he was accustomed to sharing. It was a sincere offer, an unexpected acknowledgement that the boy deserved a place in the family's story. Thomas, standing just a few steps away, watched everything with a mix of confusion and disbelief. This was the moment he had always imagined. Recognition, the approval of his family, but not in the way he expected. He felt out of place, almost irrelevant, as if he were a spectator in a story of which he was the protagonist, but without control over the events. His parents' actions took him by surprise, exposing the truth he had been unable to face. Sarah, though emotional, maintained her calm demeanor. She looked at Thomas's parents, carefully weighing their offer. Her decision to raise Lucas alone had not been easy, and accepting any help would not be taken lightly. But she knew the boy had the right to know his roots, and the sincerity in Thomas's mother's eyes gave her confidence. She took a deep breath and, in a serene tone, responded, "If this is truly for Lucas and not for appearances, then maybe we can find a way." Sarah's response brought a wave of relief and respect to Thomas's parents' faces. His mother knelt down to Lucas's height, touching his shoulder gently. "You are very welcome here, Lucas," she said, smiling. The acceptance of that small boy, laden with pure truth, spread throughout the room. Lucas, though not fully understanding everything that was happening, smiled back, instinctively comfortable with the new family opening up before him. Thomas remained silent, feeling adrift as his family moved closer to Sarah and Lucas. The scene in front of him was unexpected, an unfolding he could never have predicted. He who had always sought his parents' approval and control, now saw that recognition being extended to the son he had ignored. It was as if every choice he had made was reflected in a mirror he could no longer avoid. To everyone in the hall, that night had become more than just a business event. It was the beginning of a new story, an opportunity that fate had placed before them. That night left Thomas more restless than ever. The image of Lucas smiling at his grandparents, the warm acceptance of the family that meant so much to him, all of it now echoed in his mind, opening a wound he thought he had left behind. 4 years, he had run from the idea of responsibility, building a life of appearances and comfort, but seeing his son in front of him forced him to confront an undeniable truth, the weight of his choices. Sarah's silence that night, her dignity without demands, was a painful reflection of everything he had overlooked. Thomas spent hours replaying the moments of that event, like scenes from a movie that refused to fade. Every glance from Lucas, every silent smile from Sarah, were relentless reminders of what he had lost. For the first time, Thomas felt real vulnerability, a void that no fortune, no party or achievement could fill. The son he had rejected, the woman who had faced the world alone, now haunted him with an overwhelming force. And deep down he knew he needed to face them, to be honest with himself and with them. Moved by this urgency, Thomas decided to reach out to Sarah. When she answered the phone, her voice was serene, but Thomas sensed the distance, as if she no longer held any expectations of him. Even so, he invited her to meet, asking her to listen, even though he knew she owed him nothing. Sarah agreed to meet him in a small park near her home, a simple space that contrasted sharply with the luxury Thomas was used to. When he found her, Sarah was sitting on a bench, calm, with a serene expression that only intensified Thomas's discomfort. He approached and sat beside her, unsure of how to begin. Words failed him, and the silence between them became a dense, almost tangible presence. Finally, Thomas took a deep breath, averting his eyes as the first words left his mouth. "Sarah, I know that nothing I say can change what I did, but I need to tell you what's going on here in my heart." She remained silent, watching him with a direct and unflinching gaze. Thomas felt exposed, as if each word he spoke was an admission that had taken years to surface. "For a long time I thought living without ties was the best way to be happy, but now I realize the emptiness it brought me. I built a life that looked perfect, but deep down I was always running," he confessed, his voice heavy with the honesty he had never dared show before. Sarah listened without hurry to intervene. There was a calm firmness about her, as if she already knew what he would say and at the same time, was prepared for anything. "That night, seeing Lucas, seeing how he looked at me, made me realize what I really lost, Sarah," Thomas continued, his voice choked. "I don't know what I can do to make up for those years, but I want to try. I want to be someone he can trust, someone he can call Dad if he allows it." Thomas's words seemed to hang in the air, laden with sincere regret. Sarah looked away for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Thomas, Lucas always had a father. You just weren't there," she said, not with anger but with a cutting honesty. Her words echoed in his heart, and he felt the depth of the wound left by his absence. Thomas nodded, accepting that truth, feeling the weight of his decision press down on him even more. With a mix of hesitation and vulnerability, he looked at her and murmured, almost as an apology, "I know this doesn't erase what I didn't do. But if there's any chance for me to redeem myself, any chance to be part of his life, I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah watched him, still cautious, but there was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes, an echo of the Thomas she had known so long ago. She sighed and finally nodded slightly, as if offering one last chance. "Thomas, this won't be easy. Lucas won't understand right away, and I need to be sure you won't give up at the first obstacle," she said, her voice firm. Thomas, feeling a newfound resolve, realized this was the beginning of a long road, but for the first time in his life he was willing to walk it. Sarah stood up, looking at him with a mix of understanding and caution, and gave a small smile. "Prove that you deserve this second chance, Thomas. Prove that you're here to stay." Thomas spent the night awake after his conversation with Sarah. The weight of his choices, combined with the emptiness of a life full of appearances, weighed on him. For the first time he saw himself without filters, without the masks he wore to impress. Now, lying in bed next to Amanda, he realized that the path he had chosen was wrong. Amanda, who slept peacefully, represented everything he had built for his own pride but did not fill the growing void in his chest. He knew that if he wanted to be someone worthy of Sarah's respect and Lucas's love, he needed to change. The next morning, Thomas found a moment to talk to Amanda in private. He watched her for a moment, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. With a deep sigh, he began, "Amanda, I need to be honest with you, with both of us." She looked at him, surprised, her expression shifting from intrigued to confused. He continued, trying to explain that his life had taken an unexpected turn and that now he felt called to a responsibility much greater than any social commitment. Amanda tried to understand, but as Thomas spoke, she realized that he was no longer the man she had known. She tried to argue, to remind him of their plans, their status, and the opportunities they had as a couple, but he shook his head, serious and resolute. "I need to be the father my son deserves, Amanda. I can't keep lying to myself or to you. I need to follow a different path, even if it means giving up everything I knew," he said with a sincerity that made Amanda understand there was no going back. An uncomfortable silence followed. Amanda, proud and independent, stood up, looking at him with an expression of sadness and frustration. She murmured something about him never being transparent about his feelings, but deep down she knew that, in a way, Thomas was finally acting genuinely. When she left the apartment, Thomas felt the weight of a chapter closing, but at the same time he experienced a lightness as if he could finally breathe freely. Thomas knew, however, that ending the engagement was only the beginning. The journey he needed to take involved not just Lucas but also Sarah. He needed more than her forgiveness, he needed the respect and trust he had lost. And he knew it wouldn't be easy. With every step, he remembered Sarah's steady gaze, the courage with which she had raised their son alone, and wondered if he would ever be up to that standard. That afternoon, Thomas went to see Sarah again, this time at her home. When she opened the door and saw him there, she looked at him with an expression that combined surprise and caution. He began to speak, explaining his decision to end the engagement and trying to convey how that choice reflected his desire to change and make amends. "I ended everything, Sarah. I couldn't keep living a life that wasn't true," he confessed, his voice heavy with sincerity. Sarah listened in silence, absorbing each word, but she didn't seem impressed. She knew Thomas's path would be long and difficult, and to earn her forgiveness he would have to demonstrate a real, consistent transformation. Even so, Thomas saw a small glimmer of understanding in her eyes, as if that gesture was a tiny but important proof of his commitment to something greater than himself. "Thomas," she finally said in a calm but firm voice, "respect and forgiveness don't come from words or impulsive gestures. They come from what you're willing to do, day after day." He nodded, accepting her words as an undeniable truth. From that moment on, there would be no shortcuts or excuses. He knew he would have to earn every bit of Sarah's trust and, more importantly, Lucas's acceptance. As they said goodbye, Thomas felt that even though Sarah hadn't given a definitive answer, she offered him a small opportunity, the chance to prove that he could truly change. When she closed the door, he walked away, reflecting on the path that now lay before him. A challenging path, but one that, for the first time, seemed to give meaning to his life. Thomas began to approach Lucas with small, almost imperceptible steps, like someone entering unknown territory. On his first visit, he brought a children's storybook, remembering that Sarah had mentioned Lucas's love for stories. Sitting on the rug in Sarah's living room, he felt awkward and nervous, but when he saw Lucas's curious eyes as he flipped through the book, something in his chest settled. The boy, initially shy, began to open up, showing his favorite pages and pointing out the illustrations with excitement. These moments repeated, and little by little, Thomas found small ways to connect with his son. One sunny afternoon, he took Lucas to the park to ride a bicycle. Lucas, who had not yet learned to ride without training wheels, hesitated to accept help, but Thomas knelt beside him, holding the handlebars firmly and encouraging him with kind words. "I'm here, you don't need to be afraid," he said, and for the first time, Lucas fully trusted him, letting go of the training wheels and pedaling with a triumphant laugh that lit up his father's heart. For Thomas, each gesture, each conversation, and each smile from Lucas represented a new discovery. He felt, for the first time, the importance of being present and creating real memories. On one of his visits, he helped Lucas with a puzzle that seemed impossible to complete. The two worked together, and when the last piece fit into place, Thomas realized that the joy in his chest was genuine, something he had never felt in his personal or professional achievements. That sense of fulfillment beside his son was the greatest accomplishment of his life. Sarah, watching from a distance, remained cautious. She saw Thomas's efforts but knew that consistency was the real test. His presence was important to Lucas, but Sarah needed to be sure that he was truly committed, that this wasn't just a passing phase. Even so, when she saw him crouch to talk to the boy or share an honest laugh, a small flame of hope arose, as if perhaps he was indeed changing. One afternoon, Sarah approached Thomas while he and Lucas were playing hide-and-seek in the backyard. Thomas looked at her, surprised, but she just smiled, giving him a small nod of approval. It was a silent gesture, but full of meaning. Thomas understood that, step by step, he was earning her respect, but he would have to keep proving himself, day by day. Sarah was beginning to lower her defenses, noticing that perhaps he was truly committed to their son. The bond between father and son grew stronger through simple moments. On a cold night, Thomas brought hot chocolate to Sarah's house and sat on the couch with Lucas, who was captivated by an adventure movie. Thomas wrapped his arms around him, feeling the warmth of the small, cozy body. Lucas rested his head on his father's chest with a satisfied sigh. In that moment, Thomas realized that what he was building there was deeper than any legacy. He was becoming an essential presence in his son's life. At the end of each visit, when Lucas waved goodbye with a smile as Thomas left, Thomas felt a deep gratitude, as if that wave was a promise that finally he had found his place. Before, everything he owned felt like an empty achievement, but now each gesture from his son filled the void he carried, giving his life meaning. And the trust he saw growing in Lucas's eyes was proof that he was, at last, becoming the father the boy needed. One day, as Thomas read a story to Lucas before bedtime, Sarah entered the room quietly and stopped at the doorway, watching the scene. The boy, lying next to his father, held his hand with serene confidence while Thomas read with tenderness, completely absorbed in the moment. Sarah felt a wave of emotion as she saw that connection and, for the first time, allowed herself to believe that perhaps Thomas was truly ready to be part of their family. At that moment, seeing Lucas's peaceful expression and Thomas's caring look, Sarah felt a shift. Thomas, meeting her gaze, smiled in a way that conveyed years of regret and gratitude. Both knew the path ahead was long, but there, beside their son, they shared a moment of hope, an indication that a new chapter was opening for them, a chapter filled with real bonds and second chances. As the months went by, Sarah's trust in Thomas finally solidified. The man who had once left her abandoned had transformed into someone of integrity, present and dedicated to their son. Thomas, for his part, committed to never again turning away from the responsibilities he had once avoided or from the people who truly mattered. He knew that earning Sarah's trust was an honor that required daily effort, and every moment spent with her and Lucas reinforced his determination to be a father and partner worthy of them. To celebrate this new phase, Sarah suggested an intimate dinner at her house. The small living room was decorated with simplicity and care, with candles on the table and dishes prepared by her and Lucas, who insisted on helping his mother choose everything, even the flowers for the table. Thomas's family, realizing his commitment to Sarah and Lucas, supported this gathering enthusiastically. For the first time, Sarah felt that all barriers had dissolved, making way for a peace she never thought she would have. When he entered, Thomas saw Lucas run to him with a hug full of laughter, and Sarah welcomed him with a smile that carried something new, a genuine, complete trust. Thomas felt his heart beat faster, filled with an emotion that surprised him more each day. As they sat around the table, he looked around and realized that, for the first time, he felt complete. There was nothing in that moment that he could buy or achieve to make his life better. He had everything he had been searching for right there. Between laughter and shared stories, Lucas insisted that Thomas tell one of his childhood adventures. Sarah listened, amused, while Lucas laughed at every detail, asking if his father would try the same antics now, just to see what happens. Thomas, laughing, promised that this mischievous boy now only pulled pranks alongside his son. At that moment, Thomas realized he was no longer the same person. The man who once pursued his own happiness now was someone committed to his family's future. When night fell, the small celebration turned into an exchange of sincere and silent promises. Thomas and Sarah looked at each other and, without words, understood that they were exactly where they needed to be. She held his hand, a simple gesture that carried profound meaning. Lucas, tired from all the playing, rested his head on Thomas's shoulder, whom he embraced protectively. It was as if, in that union, they reaffirmed the bonds that now held them together, unbreakable. As silence took over the room, Thomas looked at Sarah and Lucas, realizing there was no longer room for doubts or regrets. He who once walked alone, now had a shared future, and he was ready to live it alongside them. The shadow of his past was completely fading away. Sarah, who had fought so hard to raise her son alone, finally felt supported and valued, seeing the man beside her as the partner she had always wished for. With a voice tinged with emotion, Thomas looked at Lucas, who was already asleep in his arms, and then at Sarah. "I know I made you wait a long time, but I want you to know that this wait changed me. Thank you for giving me the chance to be who I should have been from the start." Sarah smiled and squeezed his hand, letting the moment speak for itself. The dinner ended with a warm silence filling the air, a love rediscovered and the promise of a simple yet complete life. As she closed the door at the end of the night, Sarah felt the weight of the difficult years dissolve, leaving her lighter than she had ever felt. They didn't need anything more. Every mistake had been overcome, every hurt healed. And there, in that small room they now called home, a new story was beginning. With one last look between them, the family retreated for the night, knowing that the happiness they sought was at last with them. There were no more empty spaces or broken promises, only love and commitment, transformed into a new beginning. If you enjoyed the incredible story of Thomas and Sarah, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. If you love emotional stories and want to support our channel to continue bringing high-quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. Until the next moving story.